in various aspects of code fusion research. I may not be a rocket scientist, but Dr. Fox is. Thank you.
Well, they say you should always start your talk with a joke, and so here I am. That was a joke. Now go. Well, I'll tell you a good one that was on the internet the other day. A guy had a new bicycle, and his friend said, "Where'd you get your new bike?" And he said, "Well, this lady came by on the bike. She threw the bike down, took off all her clothes, and said, 'Take what you want.' And he said, 'So I took the bike.' And his friend said, 'Well, that was a good choice. The clothes probably wouldn't have fit you anyway.'" Okay, our topic today is on some new energy devices that will change the world. And we have searched the world for 13 years now. I don't guarantee we've found all of the new energy devices, looked at them, but we've looked at a lot of them. We have a rather rigid requirement, and that is that a device to have strong commercial potential must put out 3 times as much energy as it puts in. Now the reason for that is that many of the devices put in electrical energy and they get out thermal energy. And the sort of ratio of cost between electrical and thermal energy, like from electricity or natural gas, normally has been about 3 to 1. Also, the device has to tap a source of energy that's abundant. Also, what that means uranium is not a source of energy that's all that abundant, for example. Also, it has to be non-polluting and relatively inexpensive. So we're going to talk to you about some of those devices this afternoon. First, let's take a look Okay, and the current issues really are there new energy devices that can be commercialized in a reasonable time period? By the way, can anybody read that? No. Okay, all right. That's what I had that trouble when I sat on the front row. So rather than put it up there, let me just make sure are there new energy devices that can be commercialized in a reasonable time period? That's one of our questions. Another second issue, do these devices have the capability to be less costly and less polluting than the burning of fossil fuels? And the third modestly important issue is, what is the energy source of these devices and how long can it be expected to last? Okay, I'm going to All right, the impact of new energy technologies is they're cheaper, they're cleaner, they're abundant, and hopefully there are no antagonists that during the time period now where we need new energy so bad, there's nobody that's going to come along and shoot me for making a device or you for using it. By the way, anybody like to guess at what the size of the energy market is?
Trillions.
How many trillions? Somebody says a trillion. Anybody want to go lower or higher than that?
20 trillion.
20 trillion. That's the best answer I've had in a long time. We took the Encyclopedia Britannica yearbook and took a look at all of the countries and the various energies they use, coal and oil, natural gas, and so on, added it all up, and it worked out to be just about $4.5 trillion a year. It's the size of that market. That's per year. The size of that market is about 3 times the size of all of the communications, internet, computer market put together. All together, they're about $1.5 trillion a year. So it's a. Beg your pardon?
Most of it is Exxon.
Yeah, okay. Exxon gets a fairly good chunk of that. That's somebody has warned me that the people who produce oil are not going to like the idea of us building, for example, our onboard battery charger. We have a contract to build an onboard battery charger for electric vehicles for Latin American taxi cabs. And I talked to the vice president of one of the large oil companies, and he said, Hal, we would sooner leave the oil in the ground and sell it gradually and later at $60 a barrel for chemical feedstocks than to take it out, pump it out of the ground, and burn it in the automobiles and pollute our planet further. So I think we're at the stage now where even the oil companies are taking a second look. In fact, some of the oil companies are really saying they're investing in some of the alternative energy areas. This is a little difficult for me to describe our first topic, which are the high-density charge clusters. Let me see if we can see this on the screen a bit. It's it'd be helpful if I had the right side up, wouldn't it? If you take a short, a high-rise electrical pulse, it doesn't have to be necessarily short duration, but it has to have a high rise time. It's like, in a sense, I like to think of the wave on the ocean as the shore, as it comes, as the floor of the ocean rises toward the shore, the wave drags and the top of the wave folds over and curls. And in fact, in some places off Hawaii, it curls so big you can surf down, I can surf down the middle of that wave. Okay, think of doing the same thing with a pulse of electrons on a dielectric, so that the bottom part's drug, but the other curls up. Okay, as soon as you get those electrons curling up, it makes a strong magnetic field, and that north and south pole are going to get together. Now, we're not quite sure why it chops up into the particular sizes it does, but these little charge clusters makes a little toroid, which consists of about 100 billion electrons, but they're only about 20 microns. They're only about from 1/2 to 3 microns in diameter, but then a bunch of them get together and make a necklace of these smaller charge clusters, and that's about 20 microns, and there's 24 microns in the thousandth of an inch. So we're talking about a cluster of electrons then that are about, in a necklace of electrons, that are about 20 microns, or about 1,000th of an inch. But the magnetic fields and the electric fields around that charge cluster are extremely high, higher than about anything we can generate in our laboratories. So here we've got a new type of a discovery. It was discovered first by Kenneth Shoulders prior to I think the first patent was issued in about like very early 90s. Well, he discovered this in the 80s. Later, a gentleman by the name of the late Stan Gleason from Cincinnati found how to make these. He didn't know anything about Shoulders' work. This was completely independent, but he found out how to make these charge clusters in a liquid. And he found out that these charge clusters, we'll get into that a little bit more later, could make changes to radioactive materials, actually could contact the radioactive materials, cause them to change into stable materials so that you could reduce the radioactivity in a radioactive liquid. He didn't have a hot lab to work with, so he used thorium. And we worked with the late Stan Gleason for about 3 years in developing that technology. And we can take radioactive thorium, and we're quite sure that we also don't have a hot lab, so we can't work with the real highly radioactive materials. But all of our analytical work and our mathematical treatments show that we should be able to take any of the radioactive liquids and transfer transmute the radioactive materials in that liquid to get stable elements and thereby reducing the radioactivity. How many of you are familiar with the big facility near Richland, Washington? During World War II, in the development of the atomic bomb, they set up 3 different places, all of which were to separate the uranium from normally most uranium is U-238 to get U-235, which they used in the atomic bomb, if I remember my things correctly. Anyway, one of them is in this big bend of the Columbia River where they get plenty of cooling water. And now they have 73 huge stainless steel tanks full of high radiation liquids. Some of the tanks are not leaking. And recently they had they drilled into they hired a person the scientists said it'll be 10,000 years even if the tanks leaked for that to get into the groundwater. So they hired a person that I was familiar with to do the work, and he drilled down and found out it's already in the groundwater, so they fired him. And but that's what they're proposing to do now is to encapsulate that high-level radioactive liquids into small glass vials, put them in lead-lined sarcophagi and ship them down to store in the Yucca Mountain in Nevada. And Nevada doesn't want them. There's a similar situation with the nuclear power plants. The nuclear power plants use these zirconium tubes full of the uranium pellets, and after exposure for a while in the nuclear power plants and putting out their energy, they become highly radioactive, and also they become not as good at putting out the energy that's needed. So the tubes are pulled out, put in the bottom of a swimming pool by robots, of course, robotic equipment, and for a year or so while the radiation reduces. And now they're proposing to ship those to the Yucca Mountain or to the Goshute Indian Reservation in western Utah to be stored until something can be done with them. Well, there is something that can be done with them, and want to discuss with you that what we have done with this charge cluster technology, have done and are doing, haven't completed our work yet, with this charge cluster technology for the on-site stabilization of these high-level radioactive wastes. Now, one of the good things that President Clinton did was to say, no, don't ship them, and finally the DOE took over control or responsibility for these spent fuel pellets while they're stored on site. We think that the time has come where we can convince the Department of Energy that we have a technology that can stabilize these radioactive wastes on site where they are, rather than the dangers of packaging, transporting, and storing for 10,000 to 100,000 years. You know, our civilization hasn't been around for 10,000 years, and we're talking about storing this stuff in Yucca Mountain for 10,000 years. That gets to be a little ambitious. So basically what we have proposed is that we use these charge clusters, and they're highly energetic, and as one of our previous speakers talked about, some vortexes and circular motion will pick up energy from the etheric energy. By the way, how much energy is there in the ether around it? Can I borrow this for a minute?
Careful, it's open.
All right, I'll.
You can boil all the oceans on the earth.
That's right. If you could take all the energy out of a volume that size and turn it into thermal energy, you could boil at least the Atlantic Ocean. Some of the scientists say you could boil all of the oceans. Now that's a tremendous amount of energy. Why don't we feel it? Well, we really do. But if It's similar, though, to the fish that's swimming a mile below the surface of the ocean. And the fish has a ton per square inch or more on that fish. But the pressure on the inside of the fish and on the outside of the fish are about the same. So there's no pressure gradient. Okay, the same with this vast energy that we live in and have our being, there is no energy gradient. So on our inside and outside is the same. But if you want to feel this energy, get into your car, fasten your seatbelt, accelerate, say 50 miles an hour, slam on the brakes. What happens? Okay, and for the first time in about 200 or 300 years, whenever they first decided there was such a thing as inertia, Hal Fox has written a nice paper and showed that the effect of inertia can be explained by the acceleration and deceleration effect through this vast amount of energy that we live in. Okay, the first patent that was issued on these high-density charge clusters is U.S. Patent 5018180. And that's the first patent that I know of that claims or that states that it makes this statement. It says, we're not sure of the source of the excess energy, but we believe it comes from tapping the vacuum energy of space. Or in other words, from the etheric energy, zero-point energy, vacuum energy, it goes under a variety of names. The way that energy is obtained is to take the charge cluster and run it through a coil so that for example, here's a charge cluster going from the form to the cathode going to the anode. If you wrap the coil around that, then the charge cluster will create, just a coil doesn't, you only just hook up one end of the coil, the other is just dangling there in space. And as the charge cluster goes through that coil, it can create as much as, in the laboratory, from 10 to 100 times as much electrical energy out as it took electrical energy to create the charge clusters. Now that's a tremendous discovery, and it makes this a very important technology to be developed. However, there's a little problem involved, and although the first patent is almost 10 years old now, we still haven't a commercial product. What we have to do is we have to make a sharp pulse, relatively high voltage, 200 or 300 volts, sharp pulse, but so that the charge clusters that goes through that coil has to put out a broader pulse, so the energy of the pulse out is larger than the energy of the pulse in. It's difficult to make, in our computer technology, we make some pretty good sharp pulses, nanosecond pulses, but they're at 3, 4, 5 volts. To make nanosecond pulses at, say, 100 volts or 200 volts is a bit of a challenge. After I'd met Stan Gleason and found that he had also was involved in this charge cluster technology, I was in Belarus, one of the breakoffs from the old Soviet Union. In fact, it's the old White Russia. Belarus stands for White Russia. And through an interpreter, this scientist was telling me he'd like to get some funds to do this particular project. And he's explaining the project, and I said, have you ever heard of Ken Shoulders? And he said, no, never heard of the man. Well, he had independently discovered this same kind of charge cluster technology. Not only that, he had found out also that the charge cluster technology was the necklaces of charge clusters were about 20 microns. But he also found out, as Ken Shoulders had also found out, if you put more energy in, you can get a charge cluster necklace or something, we're not sure of the structure, that's 50 microns. However, Ken Shoulders found out that when that charge cluster hit the anode, it sent out an electromagnetic pulse with all of those billions or trillions of electrons that was sufficient to wipe out transistors in equipment that wasn't even connected to his experiment. So he just said, I don't do those charge clusters anymore. But Alexander Ilyanok in Belarus had found out the same thing and had spent quite a bit of time seeing, well, if it's quantized from 20 and then 50, what's the next step up? He didn't find out what the next step up is. I heard the other day, though, that someone has found it's 140 microns. I'm not sure of that. I'll have to track it down. Now, interestingly enough, you'd think that this kind of technology, you've all heard stories about how technology is squashed or put aside or whatever. The attorney who filed the patents for the first patents for shoulders said, you know, it's very likely that this technology be classified. So Shoulders wrote a book, and the day they put in the patent application, he mailed the book to about 20 or 25 different countries. And so when they, sure enough, within 2 or 3 days, the attorney got the call back, says this technology has been classified secret. And he said, but we've mailed all those books out. Get the address list. So he went to Shoulders, and the computer had eaten the address list. You know how these computers are. And so after about 3 days and $10,000 in lawyer's fees later, they said, oh, the heck with it, and so they didn't classify it. Now, those of you inventors, remember that story, because that's a good thing to remember, that if your device or your invention is good enough, then it's very likely it's going to be classified. So do something to keep it from being classified. And that's one approach. Pay close attention to your patent attorney and hope he has the skills that he'll advise you properly on how to handle to protect your own invention. Now, I have no problems with the idea that if the government pays for some research and development, they should have the right to classify it. I have a great deal of problems with the idea that if the work was done with private funds, I do not think the government of the United States should have any authority whatsoever to classify your or my invention. And thank you, I'm with you.
They should compensate you. If they do, you deserve compensation. It's like eminent domain. They can buy your house, pay you a fair market price. If they steal my anti-gravity invention, I expect compensation.
Oh, you won't get it, but it's good for you to expect it. By the way, it's later, a fellow by the name of Mesyats from Russia gave here in California at a special conference. He talked about this discovery that he had made, and same discovery, and he called them ectons. Ken Shoulders was in that meeting, and after his presentation, he went up and talked to Mesyats, and Mesyats was rather disappointed to find out he was not the first to discover this charge cluster technology. The other day, I got about a couple of months ago, I got a call from a fellow, could he come in and visit us in our laboratory? And he was an electrician at a little town called Tooele near Salt Lake City in Utah. And he came in, and I showed him what we were doing, and he said, by the way, I'm a Russian scientist, but I couldn't get a job here as a scientist, so I'm working as an electrician. But I worked with Mesyats, and I'm the one who did the work on the high pulses, the high energy pulses, the short duration high energy pulses. And then he went back after we showed him what we're doing, told him what our plans were. When I found out who he was, I said, as soon as we get our funds, you're hired. He went and talked to his wife, and his wife said, well, honey, I've got a job that I can take this summer, and I'll take care of the family. You go ahead and work with me. He came to the laboratory and said, I'm here to work. I said, we don't have money to pay you right now. He said, that's all right, and I've taken care of that. So he just came, and so now he's working with us in our laboratory. Now there's something interesting goes on upstairs. Shoulders contacted me and called me down he was going to give me something. And I said, hey, Ken, that's important technology. I'm not going to take that. That's worth developing. And I said, I'll help you get funding if I can. But I'm not going to, he said you can have it or give it away or print it. Well, 3 months later, to make a long story short, he said, Hal, I was going to throw away the baby and keep the bathwater. So then the next year I get a call from Stan Gleason, and he doesn't know if I can be trusted. He wants to talk to me, but yet he doesn't want to tell me anything. Well, it turned out then to be a 3-year effort working with him in his technology. I go to Belarus, and who do I meet but Ilyanok, who's developed this technology. And then here comes in this Valery Shevchenko, or whatever his name is, and the guys that worked with the same technology in Russia. Now that's kind of interesting that I should be in a position where that just happened. Now, the probability is a little low. I think there's somebody upstairs that's helping us. Okay. What are we going to do with this technology? Number one, it's much easier to make charge clusters and put them in say a hydrogen atmosphere, for example. We don't have to worry about the more power, energy out and energy in. We're going to take the charge clusters and ionize that hydrogen gas. So any of the hydrogen gas in the vicinity of the charge cluster, the highly negative charges are going to drive away the electrons away from the proton, that, as we look at our hydrogen atom as a proton with electrons circulating around it. So guess what those positive protons are going to do? They're attracted to that charge cluster. So you get this combination here of the charge cluster with a lot of the protons around it. Now the protons are so much larger that you only get about 1 proton for every 100,000 to 1,000,000 electrons. So the combination can be accelerated in an electric field toward the anode at about the same speed as the electrons in this tube, which probably run around 25 to 30,000 volts. With 5,000 volts, that combined charge cluster can be accelerated so it's having sufficient velocity momentum, so they'll begin to make nuclear reactions with some elements. At 75,000 volts, you get enough energy, and that's easily achievable, enough energy, so that the charge clusters, the protons, can have enough energy, they'll make nuclear reactions with any element. Now guess what that leads us up to? That leads us up to our invention of a proton accelerator, which is much better than any previous accelerator technology. For example, a proton accelerator, to get the same velocity as we would get with our combined charge cluster with the protons at 5,000 volts, takes 9 million volts about for the standard proton accelerator. So here we've got a mechanism now that we can take radioactive materials and stabilize them. Well, not only that, all those electrons there, protons, to make a proton accelerator, somehow you have to try to keep those positive charges together because they want to spread. Well, with the charges here now, they love to hang around that large negative bundle of electrons. So the combination gives us proton density, like number of protons per square inch, that is about 1 million times better than any previous particle accelerator. So that is, I think, is going to, now we've got to demonstrate that. We've done all the mathematics and everything works out very nicely. We're getting our vacuum equipment together so we can demonstrate that in our laboratory and take it to DOE. By the way, what do you think the probability is that you could sell this technology to the Department of Energy? Whoa, right on. We spent 3 years talking to people at DOE. And guess what? They're not interested. And it took me a while to figure that out until somebody explained to me the facts of life and said, Hal, you're destroying their jobs. You take care of all that stuff, what are they going to do? Their jobs and their grandkids are secured for 10,000 years when they send that stuff out to Nevada. So we found we couldn't get anywhere there. So we went to the staff of the Appropriations Committee that makes the appropriations for the Department of Energy. And this was 2 years ago now. And so they put in an additional, or else anyway, they ended up saying, you will spend $9 million on proton accelerators, not on our particular device. We don't want government funds because they'll steal what we've got. We want to get the patent protected first, finish it up, and then license it to some of the bigger corporations that know how to deal with DOE. Anyway, so guess what they did with the $9 million? They sent it immediately to one of their national laboratories. I thought, goodness, I thought they'd spread it around a little bit, but they sent it to Los Alamos or Sandy, I'm not sure which, one of the ones in the southwest of the United States. The ones so they spent it working on some big new proton accelerators. So, so we went back to the committee and they said, okay, next year we'll put in $3 million saying this has to go to private industry. I haven't seen that. That's still I think still in process. Anyway, that's the way that if you want to work with the DOE, unless you got better contacts than we've got, you better get in the appropriations bill. Otherwise, it's very unlikely DOE is going to spend any money on it. I mean, they will they'll spend $200 million on coal. They spend a little bit on alternative energy. And by alternative energy, the way we use our buzzwords, that's for solar, wind, tide, geothermal, biomass. That's the alternative energy. New energy excludes the alternative energy, the way we use the words. By the way, we publish a technical journal on new energy. We also publish New Energy News and send it out email if any of you are interested. Give me a card or something and I'll send you a courtesy copy. Okay, we're about wound up with charge clusters. We've looked at over 100 devices to get down to where we think to sort out the ones that we have, and so far we think that the charge cluster technology, in my judgment, is the best of the four. By the way, let me read you the official DOE position, and it's in a publication called Nuclear Waste Technologies for Separation and Transmutation, Committee on Separations, Technology and Transmutation Systems, Board of Radioactive Waste Management, Commission on Geosciences, Environment and Resources, National Research Council, published by National Academic Press. Okay, this multi-million-dollar study they made, it was published in 1996, and the conclusion was there is no method for handling the high-level radioactive wastes that is more cost-effective than geologic storage. Therefore, there's the packaging, transporting, and shipping out to the Nevada. Now there's a better method. Just as a kind of a quick review, think of the charge cluster as being the vehicle. Okay, we can select a different payload. For example, if we put that charge cluster in a helium atmosphere, we'd pick up alpha particles. So we'd have alpha particles, which 4 times as heavy as the hydrogen atoms. Okay, we can adjust the acceleration, and we can select different targets. Okay, the end result is we can get electrical energy and thermal energy. In fact, you can't get away from getting thermal energy out. You get about as much thermal energy as you get electrical energy. We can stabilize radioactive materials, and we think that in the future we'll be able to make some scarce elements from some plentiful elements. And then we say, tongue-in-cheek, other than that, this technology doesn't offer much. So that's our concept then of the charge cluster technology. There is another very interesting technology that was discovered by Randall Mills. And Randall Mills, first of all, he's a medical doctor, but he's while he was doing his internship, I think in Oh, what's the university across the street from MIT? Say it a little louder.
Harvard.
Oh, okay, right. I think that's where he got his MD. And then while he was doing his internship, he went across the street to MIT and took a lot of classes. Anyway, he's ended up doing some very interesting developments. One of which is he discovered that that you could take a hydrogen atom. Normally, we think of the electron around the hydrogen atom as having a particular ground state, and it just doesn't get any lower than that. He's found that under certain conditions, you can collapse the hydrogen atom so the electron orbits the proton at a smaller, closer to the proton. And the end result is there's a fair amount of energy that's released when you go from the ground state to these lower states. And it also makes an interesting new atom, which he's dubbed a hydrino. And he has done some very interesting work in hydrinochemistry. He's found, for example, that some of the, you can make some elements, for example, a lubricant that has more lubricity than standard lubricants by using hydrinos rather than hydrogen. So, and Randall Mills obtained about $20 million of funding, and a couple of the sources were from large power companies, so utility companies. So he's actually had, I think he's down to where he's down to, only has about $8 or $10 million left, but he's planning on taking this company public sometime probably later this year. I think that he does have the capability of creating a lot of thermal energy. Now it has to be, he's working on some kind of a thermal, using the heat, the thermal energy to make a hot gas to run a dynamo to create electricity. He's got some clever ideas there. However, in my judgment, this is going to be a bit more expensive way to go than with the charge cluster technology. However, I would like to predict that he's going to make millions of dollars from hydrinochemistry. So Randall Mills is has discovered what we think is one of the top new energy discoveries of the past many years. There's another very interesting this shows a device. There's ignore that blue spot there. That's just a reflection in the corner of the glass. But think of a tube of glass where you have a mixture of ordinary water and heavy water. And in that cylinder then is a special material which the inventor will not tell us what it is, with 1 millimeter holes drilled in it. Then he uses a piezoelectric device to pulse the water. The material has a very, very high resistivity, and as the water is pulsed through those holes, it creates voltages up to 300,000 volts. The end result are some nuclear reactions, but they're relatively benign nuclear reactions. They're not very harmful. There's a few neutrons come out, but there's nothing like a real nuclear reactor that we've all heard about with all this high-level radioactivity. But in their experimental, in the laboratories, they've been able to get about 20 times as much thermal energy out as electrical energy in. I got an email the other day with a request for $2,500, and he'd send me a copy of his paper. I'm not quite sure where that came along. We've been communicating with him in Russian, in his own language. He doesn't talk English. His name is Koldomatsov, and somehow he got the idea we're going to ante up just to get a copy of his paper. We had talked to him and his supervisor, and they had been promising us for several months they would send us a device, or at least the heart of the device is this special material, so that we could test it. And then we told them we'd be willing to work out proper arrangements to pay royalties and so on. So that's one of the devices now that we consider to have some real merit. The fourth one is somebody mentioned the name Tom Bearden, one of our previous speakers this morning. Tom Bearden and his friends have come up with a device that is they call it a stationary electromagnetic generator. It consists of some combination of special magnetic materials like the core of a transformer and special windings on this device. And they claim to get at least 5 to 10 times as much energy out when it's properly done. But it does take a special magnetic material that's best made in India. That's their source of the material. They're looking for funding to commercialize that product. Now, I have a lot of faith in Tom Bearden. I think they really may have something. So if you look at these 4 devices and you say, oh, take Mills' device, Dr. Randall Mills' device. What's the source of the energy? Well, it's a new form of chemical energy. Take Kolomowtsov's device. What's the source of the energy? Well, it's nuclear reactions. The high-density charge clusters, that's the first patent we know of that say the source of energy is tapping the energy of space. Tom Bearden claims that this stationary electromagnetic generator, the SEG, is also a device that taps the energy of space or etheric energy. So those are the 4 that we've found. Now, we have never found a device, a rotating device that produces enough excess energy to meet our requirements. Now, somebody in the audience asked me about the Merthynitha device. The Merthynitha device it's a religious group in Switzerland, and they have a device that's sort of built around the idea of these rotating devices that make high voltage electricity. And they are getting extra energy out the way they do it. And I'm very sure, but not positive. Only fools are positive, and I'm positive of that. That this device is creating these high-density charge clusters, and that the real source of the energy comes from those charge clusters being able to, they're so dynamic and so on, they really tap up or wind up some of that etheric energy. How many of you have heard of cold fusion? Okay. In our laboratory, when the Pons and Fleischmann made their first announcement, I was so excited. I had just reached retirement age. I'd been director of the first research lab, the University of Utah Research Park. Well, I went back to the research park and said, I want to rent a space here. And we started collecting information. We set up a little company. We started called the Fusion Information Center. We started collecting information from as many places we could about work with the Pons-Fleischmann effect or with cold fusion. We've collected about 3,000 papers now, and over 600 of these papers from over 200 laboratories in exactly 30 countries have replicated or extended the work of Pons and Fleischmann. Cold fusion works in 30 countries, well, in 29 other countries. It doesn't work in the United States, which is very interesting. Or when it does, it's denied. Now, there's an interesting story behind this. A fellow by the name of Taubes was paid. They paid his publisher to give him money to write a book. So he wrote a book called "The Weird Times and Short Life of Cold Fusion" or something like that. And a group went around, a committee went around to several of the different universities where cold fusion devices had been replicated. And if they were getting neutrons, they said that's background radiation. If they're getting new chemistries, they said that's contamination. If they're getting excess energy, they were told, well, that's your calorimetry is bad. And they went back and wrote this nice report saying that cold fusion doesn't work. A person from Washington called up all of the major universities that have a large chemistry or physics department and told them, if you have so much as a graduate student working in cold fusion, you'll get no funds, no contracts of any kind out of Washington. Well, if you want to have a university run scared, just tell them that. So there's no cold fusion work going on at universities in the United States, very, very little. Let's see, oh yes, and then they worked it out for the patent office. And the patent office has refused to issue any patents on cold fusion, except about 3 that bypassed this mole in the patent office who heads up the division where the cold fusion patents normally would occur. Now that's what's happened with cold fusion. Now it's really a sad situation. It was much of this work was instigated by some of the, maybe not by the universities, but at least by some of the professors at universities that were spending over $500 million a year on hot fusion. You know, hot fusion, that's this topic that they're doing research work on, and it'll be ready in 20 years, and has been for 40. They're still, they're the ones who didn't like they could see some threats from cold fusion. Well, unfortunately, if they had just said, well, let's take just 2 or 3% of our funds and help out the cold fusion researchers, everybody would have won. They'd still be working their 500 million a year, because cold fusion is not robust enough, in my judgment, to make a real commercial potential. Let me tell you how cold fusion works real quickly. Take a palladium rod and you put it in heavy water. You know, the deuterium oxide instead of hydrogen oxide, instead of light water. By electrolysis, you drive the deuterons into the palladium. The palladium becomes stressed and it becomes brittle. Stressed because it's being loaded with, it'll actually increase in size by about 10%. But it's brittle, hydrogen embrittlement. Now the hydrogen embrittlement of some of the stainless steel pipes in nuclear reactors is what's closed down several of the nuclear facilities, nuclear power plants, short of their planned lifetime. Okay, it's stressed and it's brittle. At random times and random places it cracks. And when you crack a crystal lattice, you get a very high voltage across that crack. Trillions of ionic bonds are split. The palladium, though, is conductive, so it shorts it out very quickly. So what do you have left? A sharp, high voltage crack, or spike. Guess what you need? What you do with that? Well, out of the cathode side, it makes charge clusters. They pick up the deuterons, slam into the anode side, and make a nuclear explosion. Very, very interesting. Excess heat and new elements that they can't explain. So if you know how to make charge clusters, why go all that trouble with cold fusion? So that's one of the little things we discovered. Okay, my time is probably up, and you're probably tired of hearing me, but do you have any questions?
So many years ago, Patterson was a hot ticket item in cold fusion. What happened to James Patterson? He had 3 or 4 patents.
He's the guy who got cold fusion patents because he went to the patent office, and the fellow who handles his patents and the kind of work that he was doing come to the desk and took his patent and went back and the last time I was really closely so affiliated with that group, they ran some special tests at a conference I attended, and they were showing how these beads, these coated beads, could make a lot of excess thermal energy, and they did, but the coating split off the beads, and they had a real problem. They had to close down their exhibit for the rest of after their big demonstration they gave to some of us members of the press. Member of the press because I'm the editor of the journal New Energy. They're still struggling. They're still doing some work, but it does not appear that that bead effect is going to make a real commercial device. Thanks for the question. That's a good question. Well, you know everything I know now. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you. Thanks.